There we go.
Wonderful. Okay. Hi, everyone, and welcome to this month's HIE Peer Perspective series. I'm Jen Schaefer, and I am the Hope for HIE social worker here. I'm glad that you're here for our discussion about navigating therapeutic trends from the perspective of HIE parents. You guys are all very well aware that nobody understands this path of HIE more than you guys living these experiences. And there are lots of choices to be made. There's a lot of uncertainty, but there is a lot of hope. So how do you balance it? Because it can be a lot at any given time. So our hope is that by, tuning into this conversation, you just feel a little bit more empowered and more informed, and that you feel less alone in having to make all of these choices that are thrown at you at any given time. So with that said, I have two HIE veteran mothers here, Betsy and Sarah. I guess if you guys want to just jump in and give maybe a little bit about your own personal experience with this. How did your journey begin? What did support look like when you guys were just first starting out, and these trends with therapies and clinical trials? What have you seen come and go, I guess?
Yeah, Sarah, do you want to give this you want to get started?
the back in the old days. So I'm Sarah Berg. My son Gabe is going to be 17 this summer. I think when he was born, so there was the Yahoo group, which I found. I also was like, oh, he's an infant and have seizures, so this must be infantile spasms, and joined that Yahoo group, and then realized, oh no, this wasn't applicable for us. But yeah, it was, I think if you think about just kind of the evolution of social media and just the change of communities and access to communication, I'm trying to think I think I did like some photo site to take pictures. I don't know if it might have even been like pre-Caring Bridge, but just like trying to find people was really challenging. Facebook existed, but it was still pretty early. And so I think just trying to like find other people really didn't happen. And then over time, I think having just kind of like the growth in, in the HIE world with Hope for HIE founding, and just having, building those blocks so that way you could find other parents. And, I've seen, over the years, just, I think as I've had, other kids too, it's just like, okay, with having like new people come in, we never did any clinical trials. I think even if we were potentially interested, finding information wasn't really available to the same extent. Access to, I think, services so we're in New York State, and, seen a lot of improvements and changes over the times, just how do you find a Medicaid waiver and get on Medicaid, and who do you need to talk to? It's been good. I think I've joked that, this is the club that nobody wants to be a part of. But I think if you're newer and, seeking out the fact that it's a lot easier to find people and information now than it was, 17 years ago, and even before then.
Yeah. What's, I think, really amazing about our community is that we do have such, now historical perspectives. We have, not to call us old, but we have families that also, like, their kids were a part of the original cooling studies 20 years ago, 25 years ago, things like that. When we talk about the history of it, when I know our kids were little, and Sarah, you were like the lamplighter ahead of me. So Max is now 13 and just turned 13 last week. I went poking around the internet trying to figure out where I could connect with other families, because there was nothing offered to us either at that time, and stumbled upon blog posts from Claire Greer and Carissa, and looking at what they had been sharing about their journeys, and looking at what their lives looked like, and really, directing to the Facebook group that had started back in the year before Max was born. You're already a part of that, because you, again, were part of the OG Yahoo group. I love that this is like an evolution of social media, as we go. But, what I reflect on often is that your voice and so many others were really powerful, talking about, you know, the disparities that our community faced and we're facing, and what can we do about it, you know? And so, you know, from my personal perspective, you know, it was just very isolating until connecting with the families that were a part of the Hope for HIE group, where I think there were like 200 families in 2012 when I joined. So, and Sarah was there, I think, from the get-go of it
one of
starting.
The first, yes, I will accept.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, and it's been quite a ride. And when you look at, like, you know, we'll talk through some different topics in this. I know about, like, you know, the state of support and the state of care and the state of, you know, research and scientific advancement for our kids and community. And just like taking us back to, you know, our own personal journeys of, you know, Sarah going on to have more kids and me having another kid and other people, you know, like kind of this whole life pathway of these journeys. It's really amazing to reflect on, really, the growth and where we've all started. And if we could go back and talk to our own selves, you know, when we first started this, what we would say and reflect back on the growth as well.
Yeah, so there has been a lot of growth in lots of different areas. Are there any specific therapies, clinical trials that, you know, you've seen come and go or come and stay? And I guess, what are some of the things to take in consideration when evaluating some of these things that are being presented?
I mean, if you think about, I think, what is available, I mean, obviously cooling, hyperbaric oxygen, stem cell transplants. I think those are probably three of the bigger ones. I know Betsy's more steeped in the kind of the clinical world than I am, but, you know, I think for me, so I've, you know, I think Betsy talked about, you know, kind of like the effects or impact on like personal lives, but like my professional career has definitely been shaped by, you know, this experience. You know, I think, you know, I was in a PhD program when Gabe was born, and it's, you know, and PhD program, like it just trains you to think think of a certain way, and how do you connect your sources and how do you synthesize information. And, you know, and for me, it's always been, all right, how do you connect people to resources and how do you evaluate what's there? And, you know, and I think with thinking about, you know, clinical trials or even other just therapies or other, you know, paths you can take, because there's options, but, you know, just ultimately you have to make choices that are going to be the best for, you know, for you, for your kid, for your family, and, you know, being realistic, whether that comes to time and finances, you know, balance of, you know, if you have other kids, balancing your career. Like, you know, I've said the fact that I work full time and have a kid with a disability, like, you know, that was really challenging, especially, you know, when if you have your kid who's younger and, you know, does need, you know, a higher level of support. And, you know, if you're in therapies and going to visits and, you know, so it's, you know, are you going to do just stuff at school? Are you going to do stuff outside school? Like, you know, what works like within the context of your full life? Because really, like, this is your life. And so what can you, you know, how do you make your life, you know, work?
Yeah, I think, and those for Sarah resonate so much, because those were like the questions that I had when I first joined too. I was like, how do we make this work? How do we, you know, Max was my first baby as well. Like, you know, we didn't know, like, are we going to have to move? Are we going to have to, you know, like have home accommodations? Will I still be able to work, which was important to me as well. What could we have more kids? Could we handle more kids? Like, what's all this doing? And I think, you know, obviously connecting and seeing people live this life was really, really important, to see people make things work that were important to them and their families. And then, you know, balance, when we talk about kind of the journey of where people start in the beginning, you know, and like the urgency that you feel. And I think this has not changed much over the years. I think this is still very ubiquitous with, you know, with people getting thrown into HIE and, you know, like just going through what my baby's brain, what is going on. This is like the core of who they are. Like, how is this going to change their life, our life? What can we do? Like getting in this like fix it mentality, initially as you're kind of figuring out where life is going to take you. No one asks for this. Obviously, no one wants their child to have difficulties. And there's just now, I think what we've seen is there's so much more access to information for good and the bad as well. Right. And so, the things that we've seen, I think, and Sarah, I'm really looking forward to hearing your perspective and talking through this a little bit more, because we have seen like things come back around, and you have like, I think in social media as well, there's such great things about it, obviously, to connect to community and to grow together and to, have a good sounding board. And then there's also things that are really tricky about social media. And in particular, how easy misinformation is to spread, or how easy it is to compare that comparison as a parent, and not just like we have the comparisons, and it's such a hard time, like for parents. I remember this, like when Max was born and my mom was like, everyone's obsessed with milestones. And she's like, we didn't even think about that. That wasn't even a thing. You didn't talk about it. People just, like kids did what they did. If there are kids with challenges, like it wasn't this like, one upping of what it can feel like of my child is like the most brilliant early walking dynamo. And then you have, these unknowns for your child. And if your child has, significant delays and then you're within the HIE community, which is a microcosm. And then you have a lot of this where you're seeing people literally going to the ends of the earth for their children, going and spending, hundreds of thousands of dollars, crowdfunding hundreds of thousands of dollars for, currently unproven, very little safety data, let alone if something's effective, at the hope and the wing and the chance that it might give some sort of improvement and be the thing, and trying to wade through what is marketing and what is actual promise for what could help with your child. What's your take on that, Sarah?
Well, and I think, the communication piece, absolutely, because, it is the for better or worse, because it's great that there are people out there, that there's information out there, like back in my day, my first web browser was text-based, like 30 years ago. And so the fact that you can go and, you can see like pictures and graphics and, click a button and have, information pulled from multiple places is fantastic. But, again, it's then, how do you, thinking of what's the potential versus like, okay, then the actual, because you do want, good outcomes and you want success, however that's defined. But, then having, and I think it's hard to take the step back and say, all right, well, how many people have gone through this treatment? How much does it cost? What resources do we have available? How much money can we pull together? What time can we put together? Can we spend on doing fundraising? And I think it's, looking at, who is doing the study. Is it a more neutral organization? Maybe if it's an academic partner versus, if it's a company, how many people participated in it? If you have a good sample size, then, if you just had like a few people, well, that's more of like a case study than if you have, well, this was a, randomized control blind study with, thousands of people. Okay. So, some of that is more of like the, thinking of things from like that scholarly research side, but, does it seem too good to be true? And one of the things that I think can be really challenging. So, if you're thinking about research, usually what you see reported are the successes, things that are statistically significant, and that whatever you're testing is going to have a positive effect on your population. But what you don't see is all the stuff that isn't significant or that wasn't deemed positive. And so there's a lot of like, kind of missing stuff that never makes it into reports and publications, because that's not the stuff that then gets grant money, which is a whole other like issue with, I think the
like room floor, right? It's like, what you don't, Yeah, what you don't see, or
Yeah,
something,
like-
you know, we see a lot of this too, of like people will see something preclinically, right? So in HIE, you're looking at mice and rats and, you know, like smaller animal model studies, and you're looking at larger, you're looking at human organoids, you know, these things that people are trying out. And the problem that we see is, well, people will scour PubMed for different things, right? And they're like, wow, this thing looks like it's promising in what I'm reading. And it's not a human study, it's in animals, which is a start. But why this thing might not have gone forward is because it didn't translate, which the problem with a lot of the research is we try things before it gets to humans for good reason, for safety, right? And especially if you're talking about like babies and kids and brain injured kids, right? And so a lot of that hits the cutting room floor because it doesn't show, it might have adverse safety signals that they were picking up. And it might, you know, not even have an, you know, like the effectiveness that is worthy of trying out and investing in going forward. And so a lot of people, I think, that are out there that may be good at marketing towards our community will say, like, look, there's this piece of, you know, study on PubMed that shows promise. And so we're going to just do this, and we're not going to wait for the science to catch up. We're just going to do it. But when you do that and you evaluate that, that's a risk. And that's not just a risk with safety and efficacy. And, you know, I'm a big safety champion. I don't think any of us want to cause any more damage to our kids and hurt. You know, we've all been through enough. So it gives me pause, and I have a marketing background. So there are a lot of the things of, you know, what gets thrown at our community is really good marketing. And when you look at what the effectiveness is, you know, kind of the litmus test that I see is a lot of these things that come in our community will be like, well, it's good to do this, but it's great if you add intensive therapy with it. That's like, well, intensive therapy has data and efficacy behind it. Like, we know that intensive therapy, you know, we know that early intervention therapy and intensive therapy, like whether it's Napa or your local, you know, pediatric therapy center doing multiple, you know, evidence-based or DMI, you know, whatever the thing du jour is. So, you know, we've seen these trends come and go and rebrand, like, you know, NDT. I know when our kids were babies, you know, the neurodevelopmental technique, like, you know, then they're like, oh, well, that doesn't, when we do more studies on it, it's not any more effective than the actual, you know, physical therapy modalities that we've been doing. And then you have, you know, the next one that comes along. And then in the one du jour right now is DMI. Is there anything negative about DMI? Probably not. You know, it's not like they're not harming children. It's another modality that's coming after, and there will probably be something in another 5 years that's something else that we call it. And that's, I think, one of the trends that we see play out, you know, quite a bit. And same with, you know, hyperbaric. So like there's actually a significant body of evidence that shows that there is nothing effective to improve HIE or CP with hyperbarics. Now it continues to go because there's some really good marketing behind it. And we have good effective research that shows that it's not effective. And then we have some safety concerns with increasing seizure potentials, you know, and then like you have to trust the people that are doing it. We just had an incident locally that a child unfortunately died from a machine that blew up and killed a young boy. And so, you know, there's a lot of things to consider that goes into this, and it's really expensive. So, you know, so what are these things that everyone has only finite time and finite treasure, right? And resources. And so how do you, you know, evaluate what you may want to do with what you have to give it the best shot? And if you're looking at raising, you know, $30,000 for something, are you going to get the biggest bang for your buck for that 30 grand? That you might have one opportunity for this for a, you know, 6-week long therapy, or is that $30,000? Would that be put to use for adaptive equipment, adaptive home modifications, you know, things like that are going to really carry forward? And those are, you know, questions that everyone has to ask themselves.
The other thing I would add too, if you think about like clinical research and timelines, that by the time something becomes known, like by the time, especially if it's published research, you're talking about years since everything first started, which is hard because, I think if you're in that moment and you want to know, what do I need to do now? It's hard because if studies are ongoing, you're not going to get any answers to what they did for maybe another 2, 3, 4, 5 years. So if this is kind of like the academic publishing process, like it's usually a couple years at least between the time something ends, it'll go out for publication, it'll get reviewed, and then the time it like makes it to print. So, it's a while. And so it's what can you do to find information that at least has come out, because then they would have done that research. And it just means that, okay, you're not going to be, maybe you're not an early adopter for something that's potentially promising, but if you're looking at something that has known, the outcomes, the adverse effects, and you really see this, especially, with medication prescription, that sure, there's newer meds for different things, whether it's, epilepsy or, other behavioral mental health needs. But, maybe it's not worth prescribing the stuff that's just brand new came on the market, which, yes, don't get me wrong, we'll have also had the safety and efficacy testing. But if you're looking at something that's been around for years and years, and, I've had doctors, have said, what, like this, it's a stable med. Like we know what to expect, we've have a lot of history with it. Not that, and you have the time and place for brand new things, but there's something to be said for, in all of this chaos, what can you find that is a little bit more stable and known and okay, and has the history behind it?
Yeah. And I think we're in a really, well, I'm pumped. I'm in this all day, every day right now, but this therapeutic, advancement, and actually the meeting that I just came from, Hope for HIE has been a driving force behind pulling together this global task force with research companies, with academic researchers, with regulatory, so FDA, EMA, others through regulatory bodies, because there's so much advancement going on, and we want to find those shortcuts, right? So that way, and we haven't found them yet, and we have to do the work. We got to pause and really advocate. This is part of the advocacy behind our organization, is work with those that are wanting to advance these, and they want it to go quick too, but we got to go quick and we got to go safe, right? So part of this is we haven't had, advocacy for HIE is still in a tender, newer time frame. We've been around for, as an official nonprofit for 10 years, which is young in the landscape. When you look at other neurodevelopmental diagnoses that have had, advocacy and research behind them for 30 years and where they are, LGS and TSC and all the other alphabet soup that's out there in neurodevelopmental disabilities and epilepsy and all of that and related things, and CP, and where things are. We're finally able to accelerate this pretty quickly, actually, through these mechanisms of bringing people together. And, we're looking at things like, can we look at a baby's MRI changes and see if that is predictive of improving outcomes with something, with a medication or with an intervention, and with the cooling studies, they knew pretty quickly within 2 years that this was, going to improve outcomes. And then it took 10 years to implement more widely and see where it can work, see what the limitations are, to your point. And babies can't wait. We want things tomorrow, yesterday, to be more effective. But things are cooking at a pace that I think we have not seen before. So, we have specific people working on and wanting to endear them to our cause. So, we have people that are working on specific types of HIE and seizures, so neonatal seizures from HIE, as well as, we were just talking in the main forum about another family that, we have this cohort of kids that has this later onset epilepsy. We don't have any long-term data on yet how many go on to, to develop that. We have it anecdotally. We're building a registry. We're doing all these things, as a community to get this acceleration of burden. And we have a couple of researchers that have been working on this for, to your point, 10 years. And they've found a target and they're looking at it and they're working it through the process. So, but in the same point in time, there are things that, that are effective, that can be helpful. And that, I think when we talk about medications in particular, no one wants their kids on meds, that doesn't feel good. But we do have many different tools in the toolbox, and that can be an effective tool for one of the, however HIE manifests in a child.
And further talking about advocacy, parents, you are your child's biggest advocate. You have to navigate through all of this and know who is there with you and who to get on your team. I know you guys, when we chatted the other day, you talked about how important it is to build that strong medical team who understands where you're coming from, your values, your goals for your children. Is there any way, any tips, like when you were starting out, what do you wish you would have known? How have you been able to speak up in these ways that you are now and making sure that you're feeling heard?
I think I think advocacy, like many things, it's a skill that develops over time that I think, in the early days, I think often, you don't want to rock the boat too much because, your care team is who's, helping you with your child. If they're in the NICU, they're the team keeping your child alive. And, you don't want to necessarily, I think always, speak up or, tick somebody off, that you want to just, accept, okay, you are the wise and knowledgeable ones that, and everything, you've gone to school for a really long time. And then and then I think at some point you realize, oh no, I am the expert on my child, and what I have to say matters and has value, and I can speak up. But it's hard. And like, I look back, I'm definitely better at it at now 17 years later, and I've sort of made a career of speaking up and, trying to implement change and, improve processes. And I realized, it's because I don't agree with something. And I'm like, okay, I have something to say. And, I want to make sure that, my child's interest is being reflected. And I think it's practice, if you think about, what is your goal? If you have, plan out some of those conversations. So maybe you have a question about something. All right, well, what do you want to ask? Practice how to ask it. Some of it's just, kind of communication and speaking. And, it doesn't always come easily to, put yourself out there. I've said, many times over the years, with being, somebody who is white and well-educated and English is my first language, there's a lot of like privilege, I think, involved in, being able to, even ask the questions, feeling, capable and confident of asking them. But, at the end of the day, like, this is your child, this is your life. And, doctors don't know everything. And, I say this as a doctor, not a medical doctor, but, I definitely, you still don't know everything. And, but you just have to, like, I think make yourself known and make sure that, your viewpoint is reflected. And, and not everything is known on a medical site either. I think the wait and see can be hard, which is why, there's, I think, the push towards, okay, what can you do to access, services and treatments and everything. But it's, you still have to, I think, kind of temper it with like, okay, the doctors don't know everything either. And your medical team doesn't know anything either. They're trying their best. And, and if you don't think they're trying as good as best as they should, it's okay to also ask for another provider. If you don't, if you're feeling, if you don't click, or you don't feel like your view is being, acknowledged and accepted, like, it's also okay to find another provider, get a second opinion.
Yeah. And anyone, I mean, certainly for the second opinion piece, like, I think we there's a couple of caveats to that as well, where like, this is where you can suss out, if someone's going to be good for you and your family and your team, and how they respond to saying, hey, do you think I should get a second opinion for that? This actually just happened with I have a family member who's going through some epilepsy with their child and a different causation. And, her epileptologist wasn't calling back for 3 weeks, and this kiddo was having just breakthrough seizures all day, every day. And, and it's like, when she finally got a hold of him and said, I've been trying to get a hold of you, and I'm trying to, and he said, well, I saw that you got your medical records. You might as well just go and get a second opinion and see someone else. And it was like, he was all upset because it was ego, right? And it's like, well, if you're not getting back to someone for 3 weeks who's having, a med change and who's not a team member with you, that's not a good, that's not going to work. So, and I think what's tricky, and Sarah, to your point of, from the access perspective, and, now having, one hindsight, which is always, a gift after you go through it to look back, but, trying to help kind of coach and help understand it is a finite balance too, or it's a difficult balance to strike of, I remember in the beginning, like, we didn't like how information was given from our neurologist that we had from the get-go. He's a quirky guy. He, was like, yeah, I think he's going to have cerebral palsy. He was, just saying some stuff, and then like a little cagey in how he was saying it. And I'm like, we're going to go get a second opinion and see, what someone else has to say about this and his trajectory. And we did. And she was lovely, sweet and kind and patient. And she gave us the exact same information as he did, just delivered in a different way. And we stayed with our neurologist, and we've been with him since, and, whatever. And we love his quirks now. But we've also had people that, like, vision impairment is a very common issue, with HIE. And Max got, flagged by 3 months of having, delayed visual maturation, which eventually is like, he has an ocular motor disability through his CP, and then CVI, more on the mild end. We had a pediatric ophthalmologist that was like, just wait, just do whatever. And then I'm like, well, that seems not great. This is like the kid, my kid's vision. Like, he was very flippant. He was more wanting to talk about how upset he was to work with the new electronic medical record system at the time, and how he was happy to retire the next year. And I was like, all right, well, let's go see what we can see, And so we went and saw a neuro-ophthalmologist, and this guy had trained the other guy, which I didn't realize until we saw him. And he's like, oh, whatever Brian says, I'm good with. And I was like, well, that's not helpful either. Like, this is not feeling like we're getting good care. So, we finally saw a third ophthalmologist. She was fantastic, very proactive, up on research, the latest, had done a case review of us, of his, his records, had gone out to, look at what the latest and greatest is for HIE and vision, and came up with a proactive plan, and that we were like, yep, that's the one, and access can change, access has fluctuated over the years for her, but we've maintained it. And I think all of us just need to find, each of those team members of who's going to work with us and look at what matters most, like for our families. I think it's really important. And we currently don't have long-term follow-up guidelines still for HIE, which I was always surprised to hear when people reached out to Hope for HIE and said, do you know of any from very well-known neurologists? And I'm like, no, I don't know any. How do you, you're supposed to know. I don't know. But so we're going to be building some, but why that is, why we need to build these is because we need, people need good information and good partners. And so, I really encourage in the era of my chart and electronic medical record of finding your key people. So, a great pediatrician who's going to be with you every step. They don't have to be a neurologist and understand HIE and its complexity, but they just have to be a good team member with you. Someone that if your kid is impatient, they're noting that they get that notification. They're calling and saying, how's it going? What do you need from me? How can I be a champion with you for your child? And there's, in finding people that are responsive, like our pediatrician changed and our other one retired. So we, kind of asked the outgoing one, who would you recommend? Because we want someone that's responsive on my chart. We want someone that, is going to get the facilitation with our other specialists to get medications that we need refilled, or, whatever it is when things are happening on the weekend, evenings, and holidays, and we kind of interviewed, the new pediatricians, and that's been a process. And it's okay to say, hey, you know what, these are our family. It doesn't have to be aggressive. It doesn't have to be like, we're the boss of this, you can just say, these are really the things that are important to our family and why. And do you think this is a good fit? And if it's not, that's okay. Let's just, I don't want to waste your time. You don't want to waste our time. And it really is relationship building.
I would add too, you don't have to go this alone either. That if you are already connected to some kind of case coordinator through, like if it's yours, state or county like disability resources, insurance, having, a care manager can be really helpful, because then you have somebody that's already going to know, hopefully, a little bit more of the lay of the land. And so, can make recommendations about what types of providers could be helpful, potentially even making the phone calls for you to be able to, get appointments and, get connected. If it's insurance, working with you and working with providers, potentially if you need to get prior authorization, if it's out of network or out of state. And so, I think being able to have somebody that will know a little bit more of that bigger landscape, because if you're just thinking, okay, what's available local to me may also not be your best care team, and that maybe you need to pull in, folks from, maybe it's a children's hospital, but it's a state away, or, something that's you might be in state, but in a different geographic location. So, I think tapping into those networks can be helpful too.
Yeah. And I just want to, of course, plug Jen's on this call. Jen is our social worker. She is a resource for our community. And I think social work is a wonderful discipline to be able to tap into as well. There's typically social workers in the NICU, but sometimes, they're they have limited resources and time. But they tend to know like other community resources. And from your point, Sarah, like all of the community service agencies will have social workers and care coordinators. But Jen's a great place to start too. I know she's talked to people about like, hey, let me connect you to your local waiver program or whatever it is. And so Jen, do you want to talk a little bit about like what, you kind of have worked with families a little bit on that as well?
Yeah. So social work, we used to only be in a few little tiny areas, but they are expanding everywhere. We are in those community resources. They're hiring social workers, like you were saying, at insurance agencies, just making sure connecting family to those resources sooner than later, to break down some of these barriers, getting these kids into the appropriate treatments, and just helping families just navigate. So yeah, I do that a lot. Sometimes people reach out for just various needs. I don't have all of the information, but I usually have some good tips, tricks, and resources on where to start out, who to talk to if you're still in the NICU. These are the best team members to pick their brains and ask them about this, because I can't do that from where I am, but your NICU social worker might be able to start this for you. And then there's social workers out in those outpatient clinics. If they're not personally assigned, they usually have access to a social worker. A lot of those social workers are a little bit more well-versed in the nuances of, what's available in your county or your state. But I am more than happy to work with anybody to, try to navigate some of that and at least get you pointed in the right direction and get you out of the mud per se, and just get you on a path that you're a little bit more comfortable with.
Yeah. And another plug. So for Jen, plugging Jen, but also plugging, we have location-based groups. And so going in there and saying, hey, what about Social Security in this state or this area? Or, what are the local therapists that you work with, and who do you see for neurology that you really like? Those are localized for a reason. So that way, it makes it a little bit easier to connect than like this broad 10,000 person now group. And making sure, we have people that look at moving and they ask like, where would a good place to move that has good access to, to care would, in schools and things would be.
And I'm really hoping with the expansion of our hospital ambassador program, that'll bring a lot of more of those personal connections and the ability to get people to those local resources a little bit more quickly and effectively as well.
Awesome.
So we've talked a lot about like the pediatric world and navigating all of this, and how do you start out and what's worth our time, and all of those difficult choices that are being thrown at. But, you know, unfortunately, that HIE and journey does not end in pediatrics. Have you guys noticed, or are you concerned? Are you excited about anything? Sarah, you especially, your child is 17. Aging out of that pediatric world and going into that adult medicine, are you seeing any differences or noticing anything? Have your teams talked to you about how to prepare for those next steps and transitions?
So, you know, it's interesting because I think, fortunately, I think there are at least pediatric practitioners who will see kids after they have turned 18 and are legal adults, which is good because, you know, it's hard. You want to have those known providers that, because you've had ideally, you know, you've built that relationship over potentially, you know, the entire life of your child. You know, I think for us, I haven't had to like think too much about finding providers yet. But, you know, just like kind of in a bigger service setting, you know, at 18, guardianship, you know, potentially kicks in, or, you know, there's also alternatives to guardianship, but, you know, making sure things are set so that way as the parent, you know, we'll get information about what's happening with medical care. You know, thinking about what's happening next after school. So, you know, if you're in the US, you know, under IDEA, you know, educational services are right through age 21, 22, depends on the school district. And so what does that look like after high school? You know, what kind of vocational or employment services are there? What about living situations? You know, my son will be in adult residential. And so thinking about what that's going to look like down the road, and that, you know, which has a whole other set, you know, the non-medical team, but, you know, just talking about the staffing piece, you know, just, you know, what's, you know, SSI, you know, if you think about another waiver programs, because, you know, things change after 18 where, you know, because your child is no longer a child legally, you might have different access to, you know, to obtaining SSI, which would normally be income-based, and same thing with the waiver. So once it's just your child's income, you know, how does that look? So you know, and it's hard because, you know, if you think, you know, people with disabilities are living longer. And so kind of having the intersection between disability and aging. And I think a lot of, you know, government agencies are starting to also recognize that too. And we'll have, you know, programs and other organizations that are looking at that intersection. You know, and I think it's good in a way because, you know, if you think about looking at the needs of like older adults in general, when there's attention to it, it means that people are also going to be paying attention to the needs of people with disabilities. And so, you know, I think it's good to have, you know, kind of have like different groups with, you know, with similar needs. Because then if you think from a resource perspective, you know, it's easier to like step up than it is to, you know, kind of start everything from scratch. But yeah, it's exciting, but scary. You know, and I'm glad that at least for the school piece, we still have a few more years to think about it. But, you know, and I think this is, you know, kind of going back to thinking of the advocacy piece. I mean, this is where that becomes important because, you know, what can you do to advocate for funding and opportunities and, you know, working with different agencies to make sure that the programs and supports that you need are going to be there, whether that's for, you know, having, you know, medical providers that, you know, reimbursement rates may not be the greatest. And so, you know, what can you do to make sure that you're going to have providers that will actually, you see adults, and where are they going to live, and what are they going to do during the day, and having providers that are also, for kids who have a higher level of support needs, children and adults, having just that disability awareness and education that, can scare a lot of providers. And so making sure that like you have people trained, maybe that, it's advocacy for, what's happening in like medical and dental and other, healthcare schooling. So that way, this is a population that's important, and making sure that you have a team that has experience with it too.
Yeah, and there's some really good resources that we signpost often, transitioning, into adult neurology care in particular. The Child Neurology Foundation has a whole transitions and care program, and resources to look at, and the questions to ask your providers, to look at your resourcing, your area, with all the things. So medical care, life care, housing, all of the paperwork, again, Sarah, to your point of guardianship and where people are of self-determination. I know there's different programs out there, like California has a really wonderful self-determination program. And I think New York does as well, where you come around a table. And if that's not available where you are locally, you can look at the programmatic aspects of that and bring it to your conversations that you're having. So there are a lot of resources. You're not alone in this, that's for sure. I mean, Max is 13 now, so the palpitations are starting for looking at the next, 4 to 5 years of what that looks like. The wait and see really for us, I feel like, has never gone away and continues to not. I have no idea what his world will look like when he's 18, and he just turned 13. So it's, there's just a lot of unknown still, but I think that's, again, loops us back around to community, and that there's people that are ahead of us that have gone through it, and there's opportunities to bring together support and advocacy and community building to really, come together and make it the best it can be for our community.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Any last advice that you would give a new family starting out on this journey, or anything that you've been grateful for?
I think, one, like, take a deep breath, and then 2, like, go forth and find your people, because, having that community and having, others who have gone through this and that you can ask questions makes it a lot less scary. Because their situation it may be different, it may have commonalities, but at least for the, you'll find people that have had like the same experience or similar experience, and that you can bounce off of if you have questions or want to get information. I remember when my son was in the NICU, I didn't know anybody else, but a couple weeks later, my friend from Aqua Aerobics, her son also ended up in the NICU for something completely different. But I was like, okay, I'm going to give you the parking pass that we didn't end up needing, and here's where you go to get the good food. And later on, the kids had like same therapists in early intervention, and we used to have like hours-long phone calls, just like processing stuff. So I think just find your village, find your community, and and don't be afraid to ask the questions.
Love that.
Yeah, I mean, ditto on that one. And I would say, don't be, like, sometimes I feel like we go really insular and like want, and part of, I think, for new families is I did this, I see this very commonly in kind of the processing pattern of like, you want to find like your HIE twin, and like, what's the future going to look like? And it's really hard not to want to bucket yourself by outcome or by impact or what you think it's going to be, and just be more open. I think, I don't know, I've always taken the approach that like, I'm open to the world of meeting new people and taking it as an opportunity of exploring a chapter that none of us expected to be on, right? And what can we all do to help one another along? So see where you can find those opportunities to both be that person for someone else and to look for those people for you as well. That's how we get through this.
Wonderful. Well, thank you guys so much for your perspectives and all of this wonderful information. I'm assuming Deanna will do her magic and get this put up on all of our sites. So thank you guys. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah, and thank you,
Thank
Jen,
you.
for coming together and for our community for saying we should have this topic come up and talk through it. So keep it coming. Keep the ideas flowing of what you want to see next.
Very good. Thank you.
All right. Take care, everyone.
Bye.